let's lay this out from the beginning. Jon Jones' initial failed test.
Yeah, so that was July of 2017. He tested positive for approximately anywhere from 20 to 60 picograms of a long-term metabolite known as the M3 metabolite of a substance called dihydrochloromethyltestosterone, DHCMT, also known as oral turinabol.
And this was over a year ago. What was determined to be the source of this stuff?
Never determined what the source was. So Jon went through a full arbitration hearing, was never able to determine where it came from, tested all the supplements he was using, went through many interviews with USADA, had a full-on arbitration hearing. The source was never determined where it came from.
Why was his suspension so low or so short?
Well,
it wasn't determined.
So, there's many factors that go into what that suspension was. I would argue in the totality of the evidence that was presented in that arbitration that it wasn't a short suspension because really one key thing came out of that arbitration. So Jon went to arbitration before an individual by the name of Richard McLaren. Richard McLaren has an arbitration group up in Canada, and McLaren is probably worldwide known as one of the most credible guys in anti-doping. I know you had the Icarus producer, director on. The McLaren report was the report that came from all that. He basically investigated the Russian state being involved in doping in the Sochi Games and put out actually a series of reports on it, detailing that up to 1,000 Russian athletes, were breaking the rules, and the Russian laboratory was helping them get around it. So He's a very, very respected guy. He's independent of, obviously, the UFC. He's independent of USADA. He acts on his own.
And his determination was?
His determination, and I'll read you kind of what he said.
Okay.
He said, "I find that all evidence available to me leads me to conclude that the violation was not intended, nor could it have enhanced the athlete's performance." So A, non-intentional. So non-intentional ingestion. There's no argument that it was in his system, but he found the evidence to show non-intentional use. And then he went further, saying that based on the numbers of what he saw in the evidence, there was not even a performance-enhancing benefit afforded to Jon for having this long-term metabolite in his system. And I think that's significant when you talk about, hey, 15 months, that's kind of light, being that this is the second time through. I would argue that if there was an argument, that maybe it's on the higher end. And certainly, we'll talk about the California Commission. Andy Foster took that position in Jon's recent California hearing. He was a little bit critical of USADA. He thought, he's intimately familiar with this evidence, both in the previous case and this occurrence, and he also saw that there was no evidence that an independent arbitrator, made this statement and decision of Jon intentionally cheating. So if anything, I'd say that potentially there could be an argument that it was, on the higher end versus the lower end.
Because of the fact that it was an unintentional ingestion.
Exactly.
Now, what is Jon's excuse? What is Jon said, how he got this into his system?
Yeah, well, look, and it's detailed in the arbitration hearing at all. Jon fully admits that, some of the lifestyle decisions he was making, the partying and things, probably did not lead to making smart decisions and making smart choices in terms of what was being ingested in the body. But certainly his testimony was under oath that I have never intentionally cheated and did not intentionally put this substance in my body. And not only this case, but as we talk about the subsequent case here, I think you'll see that based on the numbers, coming out of his tests and based on some studies that have been done on some of these substances, it would tend to support that.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Jon test negative, then test positive for extremely low numbers? This is the initial test before we get into the most recent failed test.
He did. So
test negative, then test positive very shortly after with a very small trace amount.
Correct. So he had two negative tests on July 7th and July 8th, I believe, of 2017. And then weigh-in day, I think it was July 28th, he was positive for a very low level of the M3 metabolite. And we might as well start here. So again, going back to Icarus, remember the doctor? He's the main character in that, Rodchenkov. In 2011, he put out a study on oral turinabol. He actually, my understanding is, dosed himself and then studied the excretion of his urine and what was coming out of it over the weeks and months after, and determined that there were multiple, maybe up to 50 metabolites that once this DHCMT was ingested into the body converted into other substances, and these metabolites stayed around. He identified some short-term metabolites, some medium-term metabolites, and some long-term metabolites, specifically the M3 that John's tested positive for.
So these long-term metabolites would indicate that it was taken a long time ago.
They would stay around for the longest.
Why was he testing negative and then testing positive for these extremely low numbers?
That's a good question, and that's basically the question at point. But what was not occurring, and what has never occurred in any of John's samples, is any presence of the short and medium-term metabolites. And if you look at Rodchenkov's study, he identifies a couple of these medium-term metabolites, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, and he says these metabolites, based on his study, will stay in the body at least 22 days. Well, let's look back to the July 7th and 8th, positive tests. He's negative on July 7th and 8th for everything, for the parent compound, for the short-term, medium-term metabolites, and the long-term metabolites. Go 21 days later, so within that 22-day window, which his study shows the short and medium-term metabolites would still be showing up, and there's no presence whatsoever of the short or medium-term metabolites. Now, again, we'll get into this a little bit more, but I think the science, what it's showing, is a pulsing effect for this long-term metabolite, meaning once you ingest, whether intentionally or non-intentionally, oral turinabol into the body breaks it down, produces short-term and medium-term, which is, visible for a short and medium amount of time, and then this M3, which is produced for a long period of time. I think what the issue appears to be, and we'll get into this, the UFC program is not the only program that's seen this. There's another professional sports league that has seen it very frequently. USADA has also seen this on the Olympic side, but we're seeing this strange action with the long-term M3 metabolite, and the theory is it may be hiding in the fat tissues surrounding organs and maybe have a pulsing effect where it's released at certain times and other times you can't detect it.
And this is not the actual substance itself, but it's a metabolite.
Correct.
Which indicates a reaction to this substance?
It indicates the body breaking down the parent compound, the oral turinabol, and turning it into these other things which are stored in the body. So these metabolites are not performance-enhancing drugs. They're the result of the breakdown of the parent drug in the body.
Now, how much time is it detectable, the actual drug itself?
So pretty quick. It's a pretty quick clearance time. I think Rodchenkov's study says, maybe a week. So it's not around for very long. And that's why he conducted the study.
Is it something that could be accentuated in some way by the weight cutting process?
I absolutely think that could be a factor. There are studies, not necessarily with this, but another substance, clomiphene. And look, while I'm cautioning people to be careful about comparing different substances, the commonality between clomiphene, which there are multiple clinical studies on because it is approved for use to be distributed to humans, and oral turinabol is they're both chlorinated. So they both contain a chlorine atom on the molecule. And there's a recently published study on clomiphene and its excretion rates. Again, for those at home that want to look it up, the study was published in the Endocrine Society publication. It's peer-reviewed. The name of it is HPT Axis Effects in Urinary Detection Following Clomiphene Administration in Males. So what they did is they basically, got a group of males, gave them a 1 month cycle of clomiphene, I think 25 milligrams a day, and then had them get off and then continue to look at their urine up to 261 days after. And what you saw and what you see in this study is that pulsing effect. So, I'm looking at some of the study subjects here. Subject 1, on day 121, still showed 147 picograms of clomiphene. Day 128 showed 174 picograms. Day 135 shows nothing. He's below the minimum reporting limit. And then day 149, he's back up to 236. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of, I think, 12 subjects in that study that showed this pulsing effect of this chlorinated substance coming and going. Again, it's different than oral turinabol, but it has that common factor of being chlorinated. In this study, they do talk about a fat tissue called let me look this up and make sure I got this right, adipose tissue. This is fat that surrounds the internal organs. It's one of the last things that the body burns when it's going, starving itself and going to fat. It protects those organs. But yeah, you look at these extreme weight gains and cuts that the UFC athlete goes through. I don't think you're going to find possibly another human subject anywhere that goes through putting weight on,
other than Olympic wrestling.
Maybe, but I don't think Olympic wrestling matches with an MMA fighter goes through, at least, in my experience over these 3 or 4 years, talking to those in the Olympic world. I think we're at the extreme, and it's something obviously we've talked about before. We're trying to curtail, but there's clearly never been a study for anybody who dehydrates and rehydrates themselves to the extent that some of our athletes do. You could never find, there would never be anybody with any ethics that would support a study because some of that dehydration exceeds World Health Organization standards. So there's no studies out there, on this stuff. But clearly, looking from afar, I'd say that it likely has some impact over what's being released by this adipose tissue.
We should certainly talk about that in the future, about the weight cutting aspect of it. So, but this adipose tissue loss at extreme weight cuts could potentially be the reason why this stuff is excreting itself.
It's definitely a theory out there.
What about microdosing?
So here's the thing with microdosing. Microdosing is done with endogenous substances. So
only?
Someone could try it with something else, but the reason you microdose with endogenous substances is they're already produced in the body.
Right.
So the theory of, okay, I'm going to microdose oral turinabol. Well, oral turinabol is still producing these short-term and long-term metabolites. In theory, whether you're taking 100 milligrams or 1 milligram of oral turinabol, those excretion rates of those metabolites are still going to be consistent. They're going to be in a much smaller level.
Is there a way to bypass those excretion rates? Is there a way to mask that in some way?
I'm not aware of any.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. The only study we have is Gregory Richard.
Correct.
That's it.
Correct. But, just taking it from a common sense approach, it's certainly, those that know about microdosing know that you microdose with endogenous substances, things that are already appearing in the body.
So your body knows what to do with them.
Knows what to do, and you're fooling, not only are these metabolizing and there's no metabolites of them, but you could also be fooling the biological passport. That's the concern, I think, and why people microdose. So USADA is looking, not only testing for specific substances, but are testosterone to epitestosterone ratios going up. They're looking at blood values, how many young red blood cells, how many mature red blood cells. So microdosing in those two areas wouldn't set off alarms in the biological passport world. I've never heard personally of microdosing of exogenous substances that are not found in the body. Microdosing, in my understanding, is done with things that are endogenous and already found in the body.
For people that are not familiar with this terminology, we're just talking about microdosing, performance-enhancing drugs. Because microdosing in today's world is a very common thing with mushrooms and LSD and a lot of other things.
I mean, I saw a ton of microdosing in the cycling world. That was testosterone, EPO, HGH, all those natural occurring in the body.
And so they don't produce any really red flag metabolites.
If you do them at very, very small levels, the parent will clear quickly, not produce any metabolites, and will not throw off the biological passport analysis.